At the very beginning of Book 1 of Euclid's Elements are 5 postulates. After that, there are 13 books of conclusions you can draw if those postulates are true. There are even some things that you can prove that aren't in the elements. For example, the original conception of completing the square was proven using Euclidean geometry, even though Euclid didn't have it in the 13 books. In other areas of mathematics, they call the basic assumptions of the mathematical system axioms. From just a few basic assumptions, we build entire worlds. We can see the same thing in board games. Everyone plays Monopoly wrong. I've played Monopoly the right way, and frankly I prefer the wrong ways. But however you write the rules at the beginning of the game will impact how the game is played from beginning to end. The other sciences have learned from mathematics. The basic assumption of a lot of physics is that we can predict how physical objects will move based on a few basic assumptions and applied mathematics. Aristotle was one of the first to use equations to describe physical motion, but in high school, we all learn about how Newton added a force factor to his understanding of physical motion, and that changed all of physics for the better. You can view the statement, "Two objects will be attracted to each other by a force equal to the product of their masses over the square of the distance," as an axiom. If you lay out a set of masses equal to the planets in the solar system, then run the numbers, it's the same set of measurements we get from tracking the planets. In biology, it was harder to find math-like axioms for a long time. When Mendel discovered the mechanics of genetics, that kind of pushed the door wide open. Now there are a lot of things in biology that are treated like math: population, food supply, hormone levels, and so on. Other sciences have followed in that pattern. Not all other sciences yet, to be sure, but there's a sort of subconscious sense that those sciences which are more math-like are more basic or more real. Physics is a lot more math-based than biology, so it's taken more seriously. Biology is more math-based than political science, and no one really puts it into the same category. Economics has been slowly building in respect as it has incorporated more and more mathematical principles. Psychology is the red-headed stepchild of biology that no one really knows what to do with. There are good reasons for credibility to be associated with math-likeness. For one thing, it's easier to quantify prediction fulfillment. In physics, a scientist measures the mass of two planets and expects them to attract each other at a particular rate, and then measures their change in motion. It's all numbers all the way down. As the Enlightenment got going, and we saw the success of physics and chemistry in using axiomatic statements to improve their predictions, and the increasing improvement in biology using the same methods, it was only natural for theologians to want to do the same thing. You can see this trend beginning with Thomas Aquinas. Even though Newton wouldn't come around for a few hundred years, Thomas Aquinas liked the math-like approach to truth-building and used it in writing his Summa Theologica. Later, the Protestants in the Reformation started with slogans like sola fide and sola scriptura, which were also taken as axioms. Sola scriptura turned the scriptures into a list of axioms. Even though that's not what they were made for, verse divisions made for easy numbering for the axioms they were drawing from. The problem is, which verse you read first colors the way you read all the others. So where Euclid had 5 axioms from which an entire universe could be built without controversy, Christians ended up with a world of axioms from which very little could be made without deep controversy. Sola Scriptura wasn't the only attempt to bring this kind of order to the chaos. On the Catholic side, doctrines like the infallibility of the Pope and ecumenical councils also tried to bring order to interpretation. On that side, the inspiration looks to me to have been more Roman jurisprudence than mathematics or science, though. That whole discussion is outside the scope of what I'm trying to say here, and for my purposes it's close enough. The problem is, Scripture isn't given to us as a series of axioms. It's a series of stories. The interrelationships of these stories are deep and complex. There's a lot of room to disagree over what a story is intended to tell us. When people ask me why I don't have a problem with evolution in light of the first few chapters of Genesis, I make an analogy to a couple of stories that I tell my children. One of these stories is intended to teach them that hard work pays off. The other is intended to teach them that sometimes it's necessary to break unjust laws. It's possible to mount complaints against these stories. Let's take them in turn. For the first story, neither the anatomy nor the psychology of Sus scrofa support this story. The bone structure of this animal will not support bipedal locomotion. Further, their forelimbs are not properly adjusted for the manipulation of tools of labor. The vocal tracts of Sus scrofa and Canis lupus do not overlap sufficiently to facilitate verbal communication. Finally, the cognitive abilities of Sus scrofa are not sufficient to produce even basic architecture using rectangular ceramic structures. For the second story, John was a legitimate king of England who took over after his older brother, Richard, died without an heir. The relationship between Richard and John during their life was amicable, with John raising the money to rescue Richard from enemies several times. John was a competent leader who made a few mistakes that made him unpopular. With all that said, if your complaint about the first story comes down to pigs can't talk or build houses, or your complaint about the second that King John was a respected leader and not an incompetent usurper, then you've engaged in an exercise in missing the point. I have no problem with the idea that the first 6 chapters of Genesis share more in common with other creation stories than a textbook. It's clear that most ancient creation stories are more interested in conveying a moral truth rather than a historical truth. Those who insist on reading them as strict history might be engaging in an exercise in missing the point. They miss that point not by over-applying scriptural inerrancy, because even those who treat these chapters as moral instruction read them as infallible moral instruction, but by reading these verses as axioms. No one that I've ever met that uses scripture this way does so consistently, though. Growing up with Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, Baptist, and Anglican family and close family friends, this was the first way I learned how to read scripture. It wasn't until I read the Bible through in my college years that I realized this wasn't the way scripture was meant to be seen. Even just reading the gospel straight through, it's clear that a lot of what we are to learn is learned through stories as a whole and events as a whole, not one verse at a time. The authors of scripture didn't seem to think of morality or theology in terms of axioms. If we are going to create axioms for morality or theology, those axioms must come from somewhere else. They saw it as the realm of allegory and poetry. Maybe they were on to something. Maybe not. At any rate, the axioms that we impose on scripture are a foreign creation, even if they are inspired by a particular way to read the scriptures. There are attempts to move morality into a math-like realm. They're called utilitarian models of morality. There are major challenges to utilitarian morality, and just like every other good formation of morality so far, they're based in a specific kind of story called a thought experiment. I'm not sure if finding a set of axioms is actually the best way to approach morality and theology. If all the best approaches to theology and morality so far have been based on stories and poetry and proverbs, maybe that really is the best way to do it. On the other hand, so many other areas of study have moved from analogy to math that it's easy to think that math really is the language of God. What do you think? Are there axioms that govern theology and/or morality? If so, what are they? Or is this going to be an area of study that resists math forever?